one of the things we aren't taught in school is we're not taught about money.
No, not at all.
And
it's a scandal, if you ask me. I think it's scandalous. When you onboard any person from Web 2 to Web 3, you're not just opening a wallet for them. The effective onboarding comes with financial education. That's the part that has been missing. If now billions of people have similar knowledge about financial systems, that to me becomes the antidote for financial abuse. Why would you exist in a Web 2 paradigm where you're making literally pennies on the dollar when you should be receiving your fair share of value, which is what's happening in Web 3. So that is the meaning of the open universe. And if you're not in it, then I think you're really sort of not seeing where the future is, because virtual work, I think, is the future anyway.
It's not a new thing. This is just us, but now represented digitally, and it's only going one way.
Where are we spending our time? We're spending our time digitally. Owning our data, owning the derivative of our data is so critical, and people don't understand that, especially in this age of AI. Because after all, AI lives off our data. We are feeding the AI. You wouldn't have ChatGPT or self-driving cars if it wasn't for our data. And how much are we getting paid for it? Big fat zero, right?
You're giving away your data and someone's selling it back to you.
That trade of that data commodity has always been locked until today.
Do you think the fight for digital property rights is the most important fight of the human species?
I would definitely consider it as foundational. What we're building is bigger than us. If you don't have property rights, you can't have freedom. If you can't have the ownership of it, then you can't predict the future for it. If you can see your future, then you can build towards it, and you're naturally optimistic. If you can't see your future, that's, I think, where trouble begins.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Yat Siu, the entrepreneur, investor, business leader, and gaming pioneer. You started your career at Atari Games at the tender age of 13 and went on to found the digital media development company Outblaze. In 2011, you co-founded Animoca, which provided gaming applications to the emerging smartphone market and has since become a world leader in entertainment, gamification, and blockchain innovation. To date, Animoca has invested in more than 400 companies with the goal to build an open metaverse based around blockchain technology in which users can buy and trade digital assets in the form of NFTs. Your ultimate plan is to build a global company that can, in your words, deliver true digital property rights for all. You believe that Web3 gaming is only scratching the surface of what's possible, and that in the future, completely new gaming models will be developed as a result of digital ownership. You've also said that Web3 and crypto can save the capitalist narrative by reintroducing the value of democracy. Yat, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure last time, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Can't wait to jump into it. Great to see you. I saw you 2 weeks ago in Texas as we hung out with Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner.
That was legendary. Absolutely legendary. That was amazing. Amazing.
I was looking at you and me and I thought, who's the bigger fanboy? And I couldn't tell, right?
Yes.
Because I guess he really meant something to us growing up, right? He kind of...
I think, William Shatner, as in Captain Kirk, the real Captain Kirk, shall we say, he represented sort of a view of the future, right? In terms of what we saw, the concepts weren't only just on technology, which was very cool. I think about things like the tricorder, or basically predating things like, what we have with an iPhone and touchscreens and that idea. Or, for instance, instant translation, which is basically something that we can basically do today, for instance. But also values, right? Think about I think it was Star Trek that had the first interracial kiss. right? Which was scandalous and
1966.
Exactly, right?
Really?
And then relationships with aliens and sort of strange things like that, which were completely taboo topics, but brought it into the conversational frame to a level where today we may still talk about it, but it's completely sort of part of our society, part of our culture. So they really pioneered in more than just a show that talked about technology, but really, I think, touched many ideas of humanity that is sort of science fiction, but no longer fiction.
Yeah, it's so important, those things. And I was watching it on the plane to Texas, and there's actually AI components in there. Because he
Absolutely.
goes, computer, can you tell me this about this? And the computer goes to the database and gives him an answer. And I was like, that's AI, that's ChatGPT.
That's right.
And I didn't notice that a year ago.
Yes, exactly. We didn't think about it that way. But
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So it was pretty cool. Hanging out with him was cool. I know you gifted him an NFT, and he's posted it on Twitter.
That's right.
So,
I mean, I gifted him a Mochaverse, and that Mochaverse, had specific elements. It's a Mochaverse that was holding a keyboard. So it's a little bit sort of, about technology in the future, and had sort of a rocket space look, basically, which is really what, I think he did for a lot of people to think about science and to think about sort of the future and to think about space and the possibilities, right? The symbol of a rocket is progress, right? And that really, I think, is what he gave to people. Outside of, those who were around to see the landing on the moon, I would argue that Star Trek inspired a lot of people to look at the future in a totally different way.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I'm waiting for my Mochaverse NFT, so just send that over when you're ready. I'm a little jealous. But yeah, he was big for me growing up for so many reasons, and broke so many barriers and subconsciously planted so many ideas in our brains that changed society. I mean, I would argue more than any other television show of that era. And great hanging out with him. And he's still curious, still asking questions. He was dropping...
Incredibly lucid. Incredibly lucid. We had some great
92
conversations.
years old. Great conversations. He was dropping his digital collectible with Orange Comet, one of our portfolio companies. And he's still curious, still out there. I mean, he just went up in Bezos's spaceship last year as well. I mean, that's me at 92. So I want to jump into everything, but I want to remind everybody that in November 21, it was you that first explained the metaverse to me. I didn't get it. I had been in the blockchain space heavily for like 6 months, and I was having a hard time getting my head around it. You came remotely at the time, and you really brought everybody up to speed. So thank you for that. You came back a year later when you were here at Token 2049, right when FTX dropped. And we were trying to process all of this kind of, you call it kind of like the crypto Wall Street behavior. And we were processing that. Now we're forward another 6 or 7 months. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what is the state of the metaverse? You always blow my mind by reminding me that like 3.4 billion people play games. I know you said that gaming is the predominant form of culture for youth today. And I left my 2 boys this morning. They're 5 and 6 years old. And as I walked out of the house, they were playing games. And if they're not playing games these days, they're watching other people play games.
Absolutely.
And it's not because I told them to or asked them to. And it reminds me, that's what I did as a kid too. And so I think it's easy to forget as adults sometimes how important gaming is and how maybe it represents the future of this entire Web3 space. So for people that don't understand that, how do you start that explanation, and where are we right now with Web3?
So maybe let's talk a little bit about what we think of the open metaverse as a sort of primer, right? We think of the open metaverse as a space in which we have actual ownership, right? The whole concept of digital property rights. And there's a very big distinction, not to confuse it with the metaverse as was defined by Facebook, right? Which a lot of people still think it is. So they think of the metaverse as something that's, 3D virtual reality with immersive experiences, and you put something on your head and suddenly sort of you teleport into the metaverse. That's not the metaverse. That is an interface to the metaverse. But actually what you're experiencing is really an alternate reality that is real to you because the virtual world is effectively already real to you. In Asia, for instance, where I live, most of the time I would say, depends where, and I've been traveling a lot, people spend about 9 hours on average a day online. Think about that. That's basically most of your waking hours that you're online. When you're waking up, I think the study is that within the first 15 minutes, you grab your phone or you grab a digital device. Where do you go? Yes, you might look at something on the phone, but you've already traveled into a virtual realm. So your time and attention is already there. But the distinction is that the open metaverse is one where we own our time, where we own our data, where we have property rights around it. That space, which is known as the open metaverse, which is powered by blockchain, is what we collectively call as part of Web3. Last year was an over $30 billion economy. Now, just to put that in context, $30 billion economy is a bit bigger than the GDP of Iceland and Cyprus and 100 other countries. The reserves of this open metaverse, which is basically community-owned treasuries, was about $12 billion. Now, $12 billion is roughly smaller than the fiscal reserves of New Zealand. So what's happening is that there's an actual country that is already in the virtual economical space that's developing, where people are making real income, being employed, having actual capitalist opportunities that are developing from this, many of them from developing countries that were unbanked, but also in places in Europe and in Asia and so on, as they engage in these systems. All of this obviously is empowered from banking infrastructure that is DeFi, right? And last year, DeFi was over $100 billion of basically reserves, if you will, that was locked in the financial ecosystem. It's come down a little. I think it's maybe 60 or 70 billion today. But just to give you another comparison, I think the Federal Bank of New Zealand has $102 billion, for instance, right? So we're talking about national level economies that are basically building up from that. And that's the open metaverse. And that's only growing. One statistic that blows a lot of people's minds, because to us, NFTs are the representation of these digital property rights as we have them in the physical world, is that it was $24 billion of sales of NFTs that happened in 2022. And what's really fascinating is that, there's only a small number of people, we're talking, max millions of people that participate in that space. But of that $24 billion, 90% of its value went to the creators and owners of these NFTs. Spotify, in that same year, only did $7 billion in royalties. But it serves hundreds of millions of users. All these users own nothing, so they got nothing. And the creators / really, if you think about them, publishers, pocketed the remaining and then paid peanuts out to their artists, typically speaking. So that is the state of this. So from our perspective, why would you exist in a Web2 paradigm where you're making literally pennies on the dollar when you should be receiving your fair share of value, which is what's happening in Web3. So that is the meaning of the open metaverse. And if you're not in it, then I think you're really sort of not seeing where the future is, because virtual work, I think, is the future anyway. We're already working at home on a computer. I mean, we're not actually physically doing, at least in developed countries, physically doing physical labor anymore. So even though we're not thinking of ourselves as maybe virtual employment, actually, does it really matter that you're physically in this office in the same way? You're remotely connecting with people, whether it's over Zoom or whether it's over Slack or whether it's over email. You're already a virtual being, and you can be anywhere in the world and you conduct your work. And that's really just the next step of engagement, where you then go from sort of this sort of quasi, I'm sort of in the physical world, but I'm also having this interface, into basically full immersion into that space, where all value is generated from this. And this is why Web3 and specifically crypto is so fascinating, because the medium of exchange in the open metaverse is going to be entirely crypto. And the other thing that's fascinating, of course, is when you think about something like AI, which become these autonomous agents in these games, like with these NPCs and so on, what are they going to be dealing with? They're going to be transacting in crypto. They're not going to open a bank account and sort of, do KYC in the traditional sense. They have to be authorized, but they're just basically going to go ahead and trade stuff over crypto. This paradigm of what's happening in the gaming world, but like you mentioned about your children, last year, something like $100 billion was spent in Web2 gaming items, right? And they were all trinkets, skins. They were cosmetic in nature. They were whimsical in nature. And really, if you think about that, that's a mirror of what we see in the physical world. When you think about us buying clothes and fashion, we're not buying them for utility. We're buying them because they make us look good or they make us feel good. It's part of our identity. We buy these things to represent meaning about us. And that element of culture in the physical world is really already happening in the digital world, but in a manner where we don't own anything. And that's why the open metaverse, Web3, and blockchain enables us to own these and create all the capital formation sort of possibilities that wasn't possible before in Web2, but is now possible in Web3.
And you've talked about culture being like one of the biggest single drivers of economies in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's in like high single digit percentages. It's something we don't think about very much.
Because it's so in our life.
Yeah, and like you said, I've heard you say this before, that, when we make choices for shoes and clothes, and, if it was just utility, we'd all pick the same thing.
Exactly.
And yet we spend, ridiculous amounts I think you said the more people spend on shoes, the less comfortable they are.
Well, more. I mean, some may debate that. However, definitely there is no direct proportional value in the cost of the shoe relative to its performance of the shoe in the traditional sense. Like a very comfortable shoe would be very cheap, perhaps, right? But a very expensive shoe is not necessarily the physical comfort, but it gives you a sense of yourself. Like you feel good wearing it. And how do you express that feeling? That feeling isn't a logical feeling because humans aren't entirely logical beings, right? We have emotions, we have desires, right? We're built in this manner, so we buy things that make us feel or look good. In the physical world, we also do self-expression in different ways. I mean, this may not have been socially accepted in the past, but today, for instance, people, wear sort of earrings, people do piercings, people wear tattoos, right? I mean, what is that? A tattoo is really, if you think about it, in the virtual sense, a kind of a skin, right? That is basically closer than just, something that you put on, or people color their hair. I mean, I don't think there's much of a difference really. It's another form of self-expression, except you can do it much more rapidly and you can explore much more faster in the metaverse because of the fact that you have these devices where you can actually explore yourself in a manner that perhaps you couldn't do physically, not just because of the physical limitation, but perhaps because of societal behavior or because of other things that you can freely express online that you can't actually express physically. So I think of this as, like it's already happening. It's already there, and you need to sort of at least understand it. Because, I may have given this example before, but if I had told, for instance, if in my mom's generation, I would have told her that we would be worshiping superheroes, right? and basically, those type of icons, people flying in the sky and basically sort of conquering some alien monsters, and that was what we were looking at. She'd be like, what is this? Why would we care about this stuff, right? Or that we were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on things like Birkin bags and expensive, Hermes items and so on. They would have said, this is insane. Where we are today is exactly what we do today. Everything is related to sort of self-expression and our identity. Culture is, in our view, the biggest TVL of any economy. Because
means
culture,
total value locked.
Total value locked, like
right.
in crypto terms. But in economic terms, it just means that it's stuff that you sink into the economy because of identity, because of different purposes outside of utility. For instance, whether it's a wedding ring, or maybe even the place you buy, or certain items that you have, these are things you will never sell, right? They mean something to you. It's not because they're perishable, it's because they're special to you. And then you buy them, and they become part of your legacy. And that legacy identifies not just your identity, but travels down the identity of your entire family. I mean, think of those. Why are we obsessing about ancestry? And why do we care about our legacies and backgrounds? Because, again, we're exploring about who we are. Like, what's my background? Okay, there's a national identity. But then beyond the national, there is also the sort of, my history, my family history, my background. And I need to be reminded or reinforced on these physical things. In the digital space, we couldn't do this until Web3 and blockchain. Now I can literally pass on my legacy that's digital, that's permanent on, but with one major difference: no size limitation. Mm-hmm. I am not restricted. I can keep all these things. Maybe this tradition is kept less in the Western world, but for instance, in places like Asia, particularly in Japan, your home often, your ancestral home, is just something you don't sell, right? You own it because there's a legacy, there's a history that comes down from a history that says, where you're from. And so therefore you simply can't sell that, unless you have to, right? And it feels different. I mean, imagine for those people who bought their first home, built something in their life, and yeah, commercially it makes sense to sell, but what does it make you feel? Most people will have an emotional reaction to that. It's not logical, right? Someone's paying you more money? Of course, upgrade. But you leave something behind when you do that. And that's basically what property rights does for us, and it's culture. And that is what we invest and develop in. And because of culture, we have things like movies, and we have things like television, and we have people employed in the space, which has then caused an industry to create flat screen TVs, or PlayStation, or Xbox. Like, imagine if we didn't have culture in the world, there would be no retail, there would be no sort of technology, right? Think about just what the gaming industry spawned. The reason the gaming industry spawned high-performing GPUs, which basically, if you think about it, is one of the things that the crypto community basically ended up riding on for proof of work in the early days.
Yeah, and AI now.
And AI now, exactly, right? So it's the history of human creativity and innovation often begins in very whimsical ways. And this is, again, when we talk about this debate about humans versus AI, is that a human person will do something for their own pleasure that entertains them, that doesn't come from a natural form of logical utility. I mean, think about the history of creating musical instruments. I mean, some person somewhere in the world had to decide, well, okay, let's make an instrument because it sounds nice. It wasn't for utility. It wasn't to sort of bring order to something. It was just nice to listen to. It was just beautiful. Or art, whether it's cave paintings or whatever. It's not logical, right, when people make these paintings, but they tell their own story, and that's an element of that creativity. And then it leads to something else. One of the sort of more fascinating stories is the very first typewriter was known as the writing harpsichord, because the innovation of the piano, which was a musical instrument, had this keyboard mechanism, and then they created, basically, you can look up it online, you can see that the very first typewriter, which eventually led to a system that would lead to the computer and the personal PC as we see today, started from the keyboard of a harpsichord, which was basically the predecessor of a piano. Right? And you'll find many cases in history, whether it's automatons or other things like this, where the innovations that we experience today come from whimsical and creative experiences that are very human and have nothing to do with practical utility. And now we have the PC and we have the computer that has a keyboard that really started from a musical instrument.
Wow. So we need to just understand that culture is a major driver of much of what we do on this planet.
Everything we do, I would say.
Yeah, that's why I love it when you come here, because you always remind me of things that are right in front of our eyes, but we don't always see. And I was thinking about this morning. I mean, I wear these 3-piece suits that are done by an English tailor. I wasn't born here. I was born in San Diego, California.
Yeah.
And yet I do it, and because it links me to the past, and I understand it now. I'm now part of this. And if I think about all my actions, from the decor in the studio to the gong you just hit.
The flag. Right?
Yeah.
What is the flag?
Yeah.
Right? Exactly.
It's culture.
Yes, absolutely.
And it drives all of this innovation. And sometimes it's easy to forget that, right? Because it's also, everyone has their own individual culture.
And it's just so in our life that we see it every day. Right. It's a little bit like as a parent, when you see your kid grow up, you don't really know how quickly they grow up. But in my case, unfortunately, because I do travel a lot, and my youngest is still in Hong Kong, and when I see him, he's suddenly like several inches taller. I'm like then you feel like, oh my goodness, I've missed something. But when I'm there with him the whole time, during COVID, for instance, and he grows, but I don't see the growth the same way, because it just happens progressively, and you don't notice it, right? So I think this is just one of those things where you have to often step back and just sort of marvel and sort of appreciate the growth around you.
Yeah, I think it was Terence McKenna said that I don't know who discovered water, but it definitely wasn't a fish. And so we're submersed in culture, and sometimes we still can't see it. You once said profoundly that Bitcoin is a store of value, NFTs are a store of culture.
Yes.
That was really powerful when I reread that this morning. And a lot of people that, wrote off NFTs after OpenSea went up and went back down, and the prices of Bored Ape went back down. When you say something like that, I guess that's a reminder that there's so much more going on here than a JPEG price that went up and down, that a specific metaverse over here that people are using or not using.
Correct.
And that's trying to remind people that it's not a new thing. This is just us, but now represented digitally. And it's only going one way, which is
because
more.
Where are we spending our time? We're spending our time digitally. I think the other thing is that when people talk about sort of, the metaverse is dead and that kind of stuff, actually, it's more what they see as Facebook's meta, right? So Facebook's meta has created this easy narrative to declare it dead, because they said the metaverse is dead. However, when you look at it, the facts, when you think of the combination of Web 2 and Web 3 universes, that includes platforms like Minecraft and Roblox and Fortnite and Sandbox and so on as well, then you have something like 600 million people in those type of immersive environments. It's hardly dead, right, for instance, right? But it's how you define it and think of it. And if you're not in the space, and I think this is where Facebook has done an incredible job. They've, in our own little bubble of Web3, we easily dismiss it because we know it's not real. But outside of that bubble, people actually do believe that Facebook's meta is the metaverse. And that's what they've managed to capture. Therefore, Facebook's failure to execute on the metaverse, which we always said would be super difficult for them because of the fact that it was closed, for instance, and wasn't built on Web3 and blockchain, that to me is what other people see. And they see outside and they say, it's easy to say, oh, look, if Facebook failed, then how can it possibly be real? because they, again, haven't explored it properly.
Well, so let's talk about this with a couple examples. First of all, you did a TED Talk recently,
Yes.
which is the big TED, as I used to say, not just the
Main
TEDx.
stage TED,
big
yes.
stage TED with all the really important people. Talk about that, and then maybe speak on Facebook, because a lot of people do associate the metaverse with an Oculus headset.
Yes.
And also maybe speak about how you always knew that model would fail because it is closed. That's really interesting to me. And again, the first time we spoke 2 years ago, you're an optimistic guy. Okay,
Sure.
You're a forward-thinking guy. But the only time I've ever seen you get a little prickly is when you say, "Don't close my metaverse," and
Right.
we have to make sure this company doesn't close my metaverse.
Yes.
That's one time I've seen you get angry.
No, but
Not
yes,
angry,
yes,
but
exactly.
concerned. And
Yes.
so you made that point, and I remember that back in 21, you said, we cannot allow our metaverse to be closed.
Yes.
So maybe speak on those things.
Well, first, the TED experience was amazing, an incredible honor, of course. The pressure to speak, I think I said, certainly the speakers I had sort of, anecdotal conversations. The pressure to speak on the stage like TED is enormous, because it's not only that you amongst peers or other people who have incredible influence that you could influence. It's also the fact that its reach reaches out to millions and millions of people who are seekers of truth and knowledge, if you think about it. And so having a perspective that they didn't understand about the metaverse is so important. So the pressure isn't just, how am I sort of displaying myself amongst my peers? The pressure is, can I deliver a message to a wide audience that probably doesn't know anything about what Web3 and the metaverse, the open metaverse, really is, in a manner that lets them at least open their eyes and say, oh, I hadn't thought about it this way. Now, I got a lot of feedback at TED that they thought, they understood now after the talk. But will this work for the wider audience? We shall see, right? Because it hasn't been published yet. But that's where the pressure comes from. And, incredibly world-class speakers and public speakers have come there, and you see them nervous. And that doesn't help, because then you get nervous as well, because you're like, oh my goodness, if this guy is nervous, then what am I, right? You absolutely have imposter syndrome when you're going up on a stage like TED.
And
but
you have like 18 minutes or something, right?
12 minutes.
12.
Most talks were like 10, 12 minutes.
I love 10, yeah.
So, but that means you have to condense an incredible amount of time in a short period of time. So you have to rehearse much more strictly. And I was sort of giving this comment to a few people. It's like, I may as well have been reciting Shakespeare, right? Being up there, because you have to have it so together, and you can't really miss a beat, because if you do, then everything, goes to crap almost, right? And so it was definitely a nerve-wracking experience. But the other thing I would say, and I think, it worked reasonably well, I hope. But I also, the experience taught me that after the event, the kind of people who came to me and sort of, we formed a little sort of Web3 NFT club, where it's like, oh, yay, wonderful, finally we have a talk about Web3 in TED. I can count them by, 2 hands as to how many people said they had NFTs. That was astounding to me, because you think of TED, it's technology, entertainment and design, right? So you would imagine that many more people would have NFTs and would understand the open metaverse, or at least have an inkling of it. And most commentaries I got was, oh, I never understood this. This was really interesting, new perspective. And this is 2023, which just tells me how much we are in our own bubble, right? And how much more work we need to do to reach out to other people, to really explain to them what this opportunity is all about and why it's so important. Data sovereignty, owning our data, owning the derivative of our data is so critical, and people don't understand that, especially in this age of AI, because after all, AI lives off our data. We are feeding the AI. You wouldn't have ChatGPT or self-driving cars if it wasn't for our data. And how much are we getting paid for it? Big fat zero, right? We get entertained for it. We can use it in some derivative ways for value, but where does the value accrue? In the data models, in the companies who own that data. So that's why Web3 is absolutely critical. Really, I think, even for sort of our political and our human future. I think it is very important that we have data as a construct where we have property rights, and therefore becomes essentially owning our data is like a human right.
Yeah, and you talked about digital colonialism on our first episode, and I didn't understand this concept of you giving away your data and someone selling it back to you.
Yes.
Basically, maybe like colonialism was done, maybe back even in the British Empire back in the day.
Well, I mean, think about, the cotton trade in right here in the UK, what they did, right? They would basically buy, actually, cheap cotton from India, right? Bring it back, mill it, and sell it back for expensive clothing at high prices to India. It was impossible as a nation to ever come out of this, and constantly extract value from until obviously there was a revolt.
Right.
But economically, it was a kind of economic enslavement, and that's essentially what's happening with data right now, because the value that they generate from the data, as you said, right, is actually ours, but they sell it back to us in a refined format that we're paying for. I mean, the most ridiculous thing I find is that and Facebook didn't do this in the beginning. You have a Facebook group. You want to retarget your customers on your Facebook group? Here's a budget you can spend on that. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Right? These are supposed to be my customers. Oh, no. They're not really your customers, right? And by the way, we can remove that Facebook group. You can lose your access to it. They're never actually your customers.
Yeah, that became very obvious to me. And then that whole point of digital ownership and identity. And yeah, I mean, in 2020, we almost lost our 2 million YouTube subscribers and about 10,000 videos in about 10 years of my life.
Yes.
And again, and because of some of the things I was posting, I wasn't allowed communication to those subscribers. So I had to pay for them to see what I was doing. And then I almost lost that whole digital identity. And everyone said, well, you signed the community agreement. And I was like, but that's my identity that's being taken away from me. Something's not right here. It just felt like a human right was being violated.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's no due process at all because it's a terms of service. And that's because the legal construct right now in data is kind of like air, right? So which means that the terms of service is apparently sufficient. It's contract law, right?
Right.
And that's really a big problem. Because as you put earlier, that type of stuff, when you lose it, you lose much more than just some economic value. You lose everything about you, and you're completely beholden to a platform that wasn't elected, that doesn't actually have governmental power. It actually just has corporate powers. Now think of the inverse as well. Facebook can topple governments, right? They have the ability to basically remove news organizations, which is what they did in Australia. Not too long ago, for instance, when there was an issue around paying, for instance, the relative fees that maybe Australian news agencies wanted them to pay. They said, oh, well, if that's what you want, then we're just going to sort of cut off your access to the customers because they are customers, right? I mean, that is not possible to sort of restrict freedom of speech in this manner because of the fact that there's no parallel for it. But actually, that's what they're able to do, and it's very, very dangerous. Because they're not driven by something that is driven by the community. They're driven simply for profit, and they're driven by the interest of a minority as opposed to a larger majority which you're supposed to serve. And that's why Web3 and blockchain is so interesting, because DAOs, for instance, which I think are the future organizations of the world, represent that. Because now, if I'm a customer, I'm no longer just a customer, I'm an owner, which means that I end up basically being a participant in the network. I don't have the same ownership as perhaps you or someone else, but I still have a voice, and we can come together and make decisions. Like, to me, the Facebook of the future is not going to be a shareholder corporation. It's going to be kind of a stakeholder system where there are shareholders perhaps, but every user of Facebook would also be an owner, right? And that's what you see with Sandbox, for instance. If you own a piece of land in Sandbox, you're not a consumer, you're an owner. You have a stake. If you own a Bored Ape, you're an owner. You have an ability to communicate to the network, you have a vote, you have a say in how it runs. And if you don't like it, sure, you can sell it or you can do whatever. But you have a voice. In Facebook, you don't have a voice as a user. You talk to possibly an AI, right? That basically says, these are the 5 things you can do, and you send your complaint in, and it goes to a black hole under advisement, and good luck, right? The only way to get stuff done, like in terms of all the fraud, is maybe someone senior at Facebook, and then maybe they can help you out faster than the normal processes because you're just another cog. I mean, just think about how impersonal our human relationships are with these platforms.
Yeah, and then you take it a step further and you look at Twitter files or what happened as suppression of news stories around the election, and it's like, wow, now these companies are actually violating amendments of the Constitution based with pressure on the government. So you get all the bad parts of human organizations that way. And it kind of goes full circle. I mean,
if you can silence a president, I mean, regardless of the nature of his content, you go, wait, hold on a second. How does that work, right? How does that work? that kind of gives you probably a very good indication as to where we are right now in the world of Web 2.
It's a perfect example that it's broken.
Yes.
And I think it's worth talking about to magnify and say it's broken on so many levels. It was an important and possibly necessary transition from Web 1 to Web 3. Maybe there was no other way to do it. It brought so many people so much value, created culture, all sorts of digital interaction. Yes. But we see so many examples now, from censorship to the property rights to the business models to the direction of the ownership, that it's probably high time everybody, including the people at TED that maybe don't know this that well, to look at and say, that's broken, that's broken, that's broken, that's broken. And this Web3 can solve all of those
things. That's right. I would say that the acknowledgement that is broken is universal, right? Meaning that I think most people will agree that the current digital framework doesn't work. Governments may deal with it slightly differently around privacy laws, for instance. Organizations might be looking at how do I protect my data in terms of service, contractual matters. But Web3 to me is a way that can solve that broadly. One of the fascinating things about technology, broadly speaking, is that when technology, usually through human hands, creates a problem, technology also creates a solution, right? It's never a one-way road to darkness, right? There is always sort of, because technology innovates and it grows. And I also believe generally in the sort of optimistic and sort of the good-spirited and positive nature of humanity, broadly speaking, that if there is a problem, we come together. If there's a crisis, we come together and we say, that doesn't work. We need a solution. I mean, think about the birth of Bitcoin. There was a problem in the financial system. It was something that people recognized in that generation that there would be a problem. And so it was a revolt to that. It was a technology revolt, a solution on something that was broken in the financial system that they disagreed with. It was effectively a subversive move, you could say, but it was one where people came together and said, we think this is better. And this happens all the time in technology. So anyway, so I don't believe that, yes, it's gone bad, but that's not sort of, we can't stop that it's gone bad in the same way, but we can use technology, as we now see with Web3 and blockchain, as a way to basically self-correct around that. And the self-correction basically is data ownership. If we own the data, if we own the derivatives of those rights of those data, then the third parties that abuse it can actually really abuse it in this manner because we have transparency as to what they do. Right? I think I gave this example. If Facebook actually declared how much value it generates from you, then there'll be intermediaries that come in and say, well, Brian, your channel on Facebook or on YouTube, for instance, is making us millions of dollars. Well, some other platform will come to you and say, I'll pay you a better rate, right? You have those kind of sort of commercial transactions that are possible, as we have seen what Web 1 did with general broader trade. And that basically, that trade of that data commodity has always been locked until today. And I think this is the fact that people don't see, because they don't see data as a commodity. They don't understand. It's like bits and sort of bytes flowing around in sort of this ethereal manner that they can interpret. But I would say the same is about oil. I mean, you see oil on the street, you can't interpret that, right? I mean, you understand intellectually what it can produce now from energy and plastics and whatever else, but you don't actually understand how it works. You don't need to. You just need to know that if I have oil in my backyard, that has value. And we need to think exactly the same way about our data.
Let's talk about property rights then, because funny enough, there was this guy from Hong Kong who runs a big Metaverse company that taught me about property rights. That was you. And how they're inextricably linked into democracy and capitalism, and then also having a stake in our future. And it's something that's easy to forget, especially in the digital world where we don't really understand that we have those property rights. But I was curious if you could talk about what we've seen now in America, where you almost have this anti-capitalistic narrative, which is kind of fascinating to see. And it really perturbs the older people because
it's shocking, actually. It's shocking.
It is shocking. It's hard to understand. And I think you have a theory on what's happening there, and also quite a different narrative in Asia, and also kind of regulations that maybe mirror
absolutely.
Those
and I think this is very different when you look at Asia or Middle East versus what's happening in the US. So, I mean, in the context of the US, I think let's just sort of bring up sort of, founding fathers, right? I mean, George Washington specifically said that property rights and freedom, basically are absolutely interlinked, right? You can't have one without the other. And this is also true for the digital realm. It's the same thing. Property rights are a foundation for this. But why is it a foundation for this? Well, it's a foundation for this because of the fact that when you have the freedom to really own something, then you have the freedom to transact. You have the freedom to do whatever you want with it. And only one level of transaction means I can trade with it. That's one level of abstraction. But the other areas is that when I own something, nobody else can come in and take it away from me, which also means an intermediary, a third party, can come and say, oh, you happen to own this item, maybe this house or this car. I have something I can do to your car because it's no longer owned by the company that created it. It's owned by you. Let me give you a paint job for your car. You don't like that red color? I'll make it silver. I'll make it blue. And you just created a relationship and a job. And again, that service element, by the way, that network effect that was created from that person who gave you value to the car might give value to other cars in the same manner. What happens to the object, the car that you own? It's more valuable to you. And the utility of the car expanded from, beyond a transportation device to something that makes you feel good, or to something that expresses you, for instance, right? There are thousands of companies that are now in existence because we own cars. There are thousands of companies in existence because we can own our phones. Like you can buy headphones and you can get phone cases. There are myriads of companies that provide services because you own a house. For instance, from furniture, from art, from banking services, right? If we didn't have property rights, you can't do any of that stuff. There's also no capital formation with property rights because I can't invest. If I don't own something, then I can't really put value into it for the long term. If I know I own this, I can invest with a 20-year, 30-year business plan. If I own my real estate, I can build a restaurant, I can build a business, knowing that this is mine and I can invest in it. Just think about when you own a house, how you think about renovating your own house versus a rental home. I mean, that's a feeling, but it's fact, right? You are never going to invest as much money into that. And that's the paradigm. So you have basically capital formation. The countries, this is already very well studied. All the countries that have very strong property rights, physical property rights, have very high GDPs. The US, or Hong Kong, Singapore, the UK, right? And the countries that have no property rights, North Korea, or low property rights, many sort of African or sort of certain South American countries as well.
Where they don't even know if their property will be there next year because somebody might take it.
Because the government either takes it or the government is overthrown.
Right.
I think another thing that a lot of people don't understand is how property rights works, particularly the youth, because they think of, I live in this house, it's physical, therefore it's real. But the ownership of this house is not made real because of the bricks it's built on. It's made real because of a virtual contract that is the Constitution in America, or it's contract law in other places around the world. It's the government that enables it. Because if that government disappears, that house you think you own, you don't own either. So our actual physical rights and ownership are virtual constructs upheld by people who we elected, which is a democratic system as well. If you have a monarch, or you have a despot, or you have basically someone who has sort of dictatorial powers, they get to decide whether you can own it or not. And it's not something that you can change. And so while it may appear that he's a benevolent dictator, so it may work for a little while, but he might die, right? As they don't live forever. A new person comes in with that kind of central power. We do not know whether this person will change. So how do you ensure that safety? This is where things like a democratic framework, where things like a constitution start to come in, because you have a framework that you respect. And I think the war, if you want to call it, that sort of ideological war that's happening in the US, is very much a war on how people interpret the Constitution. And it comes, unfortunately, on the back of, I think, politics in terms of how you get elected. Not necessarily what's right for the country in many cases. The irony is that the rest of the world still aspires to American ideas, right? They may not necessarily agree what's happening in America, but the American idea of property rights and liberty and freedom is actually what other countries want. Asia, for instance, is actually a place where capitalism is thriving. There is inequity, but because in living memory, people are actually better off than they were before because of a capitalist framework, because of the introduction of property rights. Most people don't remember or even know that South Korea in the early 80s had a lower GDP than North Korea.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.